It started with whispers. Not the kind you overhear in a crowded room, but the ones that come when you enter a space and suddenly, everything goes quiet. The kind that sink into the walls of your home, your marriage, your family, until one day you wake up and realize they've turned into something unspoken, something poisonous. The day I lost my son, I lost my life as I knew it. But grief was only the beginning. Mark wasn't in the hospital room when it happened. He had stepped out for coffee, or maybe he just needed to get away from me for a while. When he came back, my hands were still on my stomach, numb and empty, as the nurse quietly adjusted the monitors that no longer beeped in time with the heartbeat that had once been there. He didn't say anything. Not right away. He just stood in the doorway, holding a cup of coffee that was already cold, his expression blank in a way that made my skin prickle. I expected him to come to me, to hold me, to grieve with me. But he didn't. And then his mother arrived. She stormed into the room like she was the one who had lost something, like she was the one who had been ripped apart from the inside out. The first thing she did wasn't to console me. She didn't cry for me or hug her son. No, the first thing she did was look at me with those cold, calculating eyes and say, "What did you do?" The words didn't register at first. I thought maybe she had misspoken. Maybe she meant to ask what had happened, or if I was okay. But then she took a step closer, her face twisted in something too sharp to be grief. "You killed him." My breath hitched. I shook my head, trying to sit up, but my body was weak, still raw from what had just happened. "No," I whispered. It wasn't. Mark's father was there too, standing behind his wife like a shadow, nodding grimly as if this was something they had expected all along. "I told you," his mother continued, voice rising. "I told you something like this would happen. I knew she wasn't strong enough to carry a child. But did you listen? No, Mark, you didn't. And now look. Now look." Her voice cracked and suddenly, she was crying. Not for me. Not for my pain. She was crying for herself, for her loss, for the grandson she believed had been stolen from her. And the worst part? The part that shattered me more than anything? Mark didn't say a word. He just stood there, silent. I turned to him, my throat burning, my hands gripping the thin hospital blanket like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to the world. "Mark," I choked out, "tell them. Tell them this wasn't my fault." His jaw tightened. His fingers curled into fists. He looked at me, then at his parents. And then, in a voice so quiet I almost wished I hadn't heard it, he said, "Maybe they're right." Something inside me broke. I expected rage. I expected shouting, accusations, a storm of anger to match the hurricane inside me. But there was nothing. Just a hollow emptiness where my heart used to be. The doctors told me it was a chromosomal abnormality. That it wasn't my fault. That it could have happened to anyone. But science didn't matter to my in-laws. Facts didn't matter. They had already made up their minds. I was defective. And in that moment, as I lay in that hospital bed with my body still aching from the life it had failed to protect, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't just mourning my son. I was mourning the life I had before this moment. Because nothing would ever be the same again. I left the hospital alone. Mark didn't ride with me, didn't even ask if I needed him to. His mother had taken him by the arm, speaking to him in hushed tones, and when I looked at him one last time before the nurse wheeled me out, his eyes were fixed on the floor. Like he couldn't bear to look at me. Like the sight of me disgusted him. They didn't even let me grieve. The day I got home, his mother was already there, sitting in my living room like she owned the place, speaking in a voice that was too calm for the accusations she was throwing at me. She wasn't crying anymore. She was composed, sharp, and every sentence was designed to cut into me. "You need to understand," she said, crossing her legs, hands folded neatly in her lap. "This is not just about you. This is about what you've taken from us." I was too exhausted to respond. My body was still in pain, my mind barely functioning, and yet I was expected to sit here and listen to this. "My grandson is gone," she continued, and there was a deliberate pause before she added, "because of you." Mark sat beside her, stiff and silent. He should have defended me. He should have stopped this conversation before it even started. But he didn't. I pressed my fingers against my temples, trying to keep my voice steady. The doctors said it wasn't my fault. It was a genetic condition. There was nothing anyone could have done. She scoffed, shaking her head like I was a child who didn't understand how the world worked. Doctors say a lot of things. That doesn't mean it's true. You're the one who carried him. You were responsible for him. And you couldn't even do that right. Something in my chest tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. You think I wanted this? My voice cracked despite my efforts. You think I wanted to lose my baby? Do you have any idea what this feels like? She didn't even hesitate. You'll never know what this feels like, she said coldly. Because you're not a mother. You never will be. I turned to Mark, my last hope in this nightmare. Are you really going to sit there and let her say this to me? His hands clenched into fists, but he didn't look at me. She's grieving. I stared at him in disbelief. And what about me? His silence was the answer. His mother leaned forward, voice softening, but not in kindness. You should do the right thing, dear. Let Mark be with someone who can give him a family. I felt the blood drain from my face. Excuse me? You've taken enough from him. Don't take his future too. The world around me blurred. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the faint sound of cars outside, the clock ticking on the wall. And then, without another word, I stood up and walked to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. For hours, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. My wedding ring felt heavy on my hand, a reminder of a promise that clearly meant nothing to him anymore. I should have cried. I should have screamed. But I felt nothing, just an emptiness that refused to be filled. By the time I left the room, Mark was gone. His mother, too. The house was silent, and for the first time, I realized what was coming next. They weren't going to let this go. And neither was I. The first time Mark didn't come home, I told myself it was just for the night. He needed space. His mother was poisoning his mind, but surely he would come back to me. We had been together for 6 years, married for 3. That didn't just disappear overnight. But then one night became 2, 2 became a week, and eventually, I stopped checking my phone, stopped waiting for the sound of his key in the door. He wasn't coming back, and he didn't even have the decency to tell me himself. Instead, his father called. It wasn't even a conversation. Just a cold, matter-of-fact statement. Mark won't be returning to the house. He needs time to think. I knew what that meant. His mother had won. She had convinced him that I wasn't worth standing by. That I was broken, useless, and incapable of giving him the family they wanted. And he had let her. You need to leave, his father continued, as if this was a reasonable request. That house was meant for a family, and you're just one person now. I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. The house is mine too. We bought it together. You bought it as a married couple, he corrected. And you won't be married much longer. I hung up without another word. The next morning, I met with a lawyer. I didn't want to believe it, but I had to be prepared. If Mark was willing to abandon me in my worst moment, I needed to accept that he was capable of taking everything else too. What I wasn't prepared for was what my lawyer told me. They've already started the paperwork, she said, sliding a file across the desk. They're filing for divorce. They're going after the house, the savings, everything. I barely heard the rest of what she said. My ears were ringing, my stomach twisted in knots. Mark had made his choice, and he hadn't even told me. I was nothing to him now. Just an inconvenience he wanted to erase as quickly as possible. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to focus. What are my options? She studied me for a moment before responding. Legally, they can't force you out of the house until the divorce is finalized. And even then, you have a right to half of everything. But they'll fight you on it. They'll make this as difficult as possible. I nodded. Let them try. 2 days later, Mark finally showed up. Not alone, his mother was with him, of course. He didn't even have the decency to look guilty as he stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, eyes darting around like he didn't recognize the place anymore. We need to talk, he said. I crossed my arms. Now you want to talk? His mother sighed, stepping past him into the house like she owned it. There's no need for hostility. We just want to settle this in a way that's best for everyone. I didn't even look at her. I'll talk to my husband alone. Mark hesitated, but to my surprise, he nodded. His mother gave me a sharp look before walking back to the car. For a long moment, we just stood there. I waited for him to say something, anything, that would make me believe he was still the man I married. That there was still something left of us to salvage. But when he finally spoke, his words were colder than I expected. You should move out. I almost laughed. That's what you came here to say? It's not just about me, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. My parents. Your parents. I cut him off. This is our marriage, Mark. Or at least it was. Since when do they get to decide what happens to us? He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. It's not like that. They think it would be best if we both had a clean break. I took a step closer, forcing him to actually look at me. And what do you think? His jaw tightened. I think this isn't working anymore. I stared at him, waiting for him to take it back, waiting for him to realize how much he was hurting me. But he didn't. He just stood there, waiting for me to accept it. You're a coward, I said finally, my voice calm despite the storm raging inside me. You let them get in your head. You let them turn you against me. His expression hardened. This isn't just about them. You lost the baby, and now you're acting like... Like what? My voice rose, sharp with anger. Like a woman who just lost her child? Like someone who expected her husband to stand by her instead of running away the first chance he got. He flinched but didn't respond. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I'm not leaving, Mark. You want a divorce? Fine. But I'm not giving up my home just because your parents decided I don't belong here. He exhaled, frustrated. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I shook my head. No, Mark. You did that the second you chose them over me. He left without another word. I closed the door behind him and locked it. If they wanted to take this from me, they would have to fight for it. And I wasn't going down without one. 2 weeks after Mark walked out, I found out just how far his family was willing to go to erase me. It started with a letter from their lawyer, delivered to my door like a warning shot. They weren't just pushing for a divorce, they were claiming I had no right to the house, no right to the money in our accounts, no right to anything tied to Mark. Their reasoning? I was an unfit wife who had failed to uphold the responsibilities of marriage. It was disgusting, but I wasn't surprised. His parents had always treated me like I wasn't good enough, and now they had the perfect excuse to get rid of me completely. I took the letter straight to my lawyer. She barely blinked as she read through it, then looked up at me with something close to amusement. They're bluffing, she said. This is an intimidation tactic. They don't have a legal basis to cut you out like this. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. So what do we do? She smirked. We fight back. I thought I was ready for that fight. I thought I understood how cruel his family could be. But nothing prepared me for what happened next. A week later, I came home to find Mark and his father standing in the driveway. His father had a folder tucked under his arm, and the second I saw them, I knew this wasn't just another attempt to pressure me into leaving. This was something worse. I walked past them, unlocking the front door, but before I could step inside, Mark grabbed my arm. We need to talk. I yanked my arm free and turned to face him. We have nothing to talk about. His father sighed like I was some stubborn child. Listen, we're trying to be reasonable here. I laughed, short and sharp. Reasonable? You're trying to take everything from me. Mark shifted uncomfortably, but his father stayed calm. We're offering you a deal, he said, holding up the folder. You sign this, you get a settlement, and you walk away without a fight. I snatched the papers from his hand and skimmed through them. They wanted me out of the house immediately. They were offering me a fraction of what I was entitled to, barely enough to cover a few months of rent somewhere else. And in return, I had to give up all claims to the house, the savings, and any future financial support. I shoved the papers back at him. Absolutely not. Mark finally spoke, his voice tired. Come on, don't do this. You know this marriage is over. I stared at him, feeling nothing but disgust. I don't care about the marriage anymore, Mark. But I'm not going to let you and your parents destroy me just because it's convenient for you. His father's jaw tightened. If you fight us, you'll lose. We have more resources, more lawyers. This could take years, and in the end, you'll walk away with nothing. I folded my arms. Then I guess I better get comfortable. Mark exhaled sharply. Why are you making this so hard? I took a step closer, lowering my voice. Because you and your family think you can bully me into disappearing. But I'm not going anywhere. His father muttered something under his breath and turned to leave, but Mark hesitated. For a second, I thought maybe, just maybe, he would finally stand up for me. But then he shook his head and followed his father to the car. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, heard their words. They wanted me to give up. They wanted me to walk away like I had never been part of Mark's life, like I had never built this home with him. But the more they pushed, the angrier I became. The next morning, I called my lawyer. I want to fight, I said. She smiled through the phone. Good. Because I just found something that might turn this case upside down. My lawyer didn't waste time. She told me to meet her at her office that afternoon, and when I arrived, she was already flipping through a thick stack of papers with a satisfied look on her face. She didn't ask how I was doing. She already knew. Instead, she slid the documents across the desk and tapped a highlighted section. Mark's financials, she said. And his parents. You're going to want to see this. I picked up the papers and scanned the numbers. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then, slowly, it clicked. Mark had been making withdrawals, large ones, months before the miscarriage. Not for anything we had discussed. Not for medical expenses, not for home renovations. The money was going somewhere else, and the pattern was clear. I looked up. Where did it go? She leaned back in her chair. A separate account under his mother's name. And that's not all. His parents took out a loan against this house right after you were hospitalized. My stomach turned. Why would they do that? She shrugged. Either they're desperate, or they assumed you'd roll over and sign everything away without looking into it. I felt the heat rise in my chest. So they're broke. Not yet. But close. If they lose this case, they're in trouble. I set the papers down carefully. Can we use this? She nodded. Absolutely. They tried to frame you as the weak one in this divorce, as someone disposable. But they made a mistake. They got greedy. And now we have leverage. That night, I waited. I knew Mark would come back, and I wanted to be ready when he did. Sure enough, just past 8, his car pulled into the driveway. This time, he came alone. No father, no mother, just him. He hesitated at the door, probably expecting me to slam it in his face. Instead, I opened it and stepped aside. He walked in, hands shoved into his pockets, looking around like he barely recognized the place. I shouldn't be here, he muttered. Then don't be. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Look, I don't want this to get ugly. I folded my arms. Then maybe you shouldn't have tried to take everything from me. He let out a bitter laugh. Come on, you know that's not how it is. I grabbed the documents from the table and tossed them onto the counter. Then explain this. He frowned, stepping forward to read them. As his eyes moved down the page, his face paled. Where did you get this? Doesn't matter. What matters is that I know everything. Your parents are in financial trouble, and they tried to use this divorce to bail themselves out. You helped them. You knew what they were doing, and you still tried to push me out with nothing. He set the papers down carefully. It's not like that. Then tell me what it is. He didn't answer. Because there was nothing he could say. I took a step forward. You could have told me. You could have been honest. Instead, you let them treat me like garbage while they drained everything behind your back. And you still expect me to just leave quietly? His jaw tightened. What do you want? I want my share of everything. And I want you and your family to stop acting like I'm some broken thing you can throw away. He swallowed, looking down at the papers again. If we go to court, this could ruin them. I didn't flinch. That's not my problem. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to argue. Then his shoulders sagged. Fine, he said. You'll get what you're owed. He turned to leave, but I wasn't finished. One more thing. He paused at the door. Do you even feel guilty? His hand hovered over the doorknob. He didn't look back when he spoke. I don't know. Then he left. The next morning, my lawyer called. They're settling, she said. You got everything you asked for. I exhaled, gripping the phone tightly. Good. She hesitated. You could have pushed for more. You could have ruined them. I closed my eyes. I got what I needed. That's enough. The case was over within weeks. The house was mine. The accounts were split. Mark's parents were forced to pay back what they had taken. I didn't care what happened to them after that. The day I signed the final papers, I sat alone in the house they had tried to take from me. It was quiet, empty, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was the one who had lost. I had survived, and that was enough.